Hello and welcome back to the Karma Stories podcast. I'm Rob and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today I have 3 stories for you from the Malicious Compliance subreddit. Alright, today's question of the day. I do get a bunch of demographics on who watches my content, but I'd like to know from you guys straight up, where do you live? I'm not looking for an address, obviously, but a state, a country, a province, whatever works. Where do you live? Comment down below. Alright, on to today's stories. Let's jump right in. This story comes to us from WideTrip8392. No assistant for me? Let's see how that works out. This happened almost 15 years ago when I was still living in my home country. I worked in a warehouse that served as a distribution center for a supermarket chain. A very famous one, by the way. I was an inspector in the shipping department. Basically, the sorting section would bring to the docks the goods that the store had requested, and we would prepare and load the shipment onto the truck. In the shipping department, there were assistants who did the manual work, assembling the loads on pallets, wrapping them with stretch film, and loading them onto the truck, while the inspector checked whether everything being sent to the store was correctly labeled and secure for transport. Additionally, the inspector entered all data in the internal system, sealed the truck, and printed the load summary for the administrative department to generate an invoice. Of course, inspectors also helped the assistants with the heavy lifting. Most of the time, this didn't interfere with our main responsibilities and actually sped up the process, especially since our shift, the afternoon shift, had an issue with trucks arriving late. Many times, we wouldn't finish everything on time, leading to overtime and sometimes having to leave the remaining work for the night shift, which wasn't ideal, since each shift had its own list of stores to attend to, and this delay would affect them. Each inspector worked with at least one assistant, but sometimes more, depending on their workload. Some inspectors had more stores to handle that day, some stores required extra loads, or other situations that called for additional help. We had a supervisor who had been with the company for many years, and had worked in the department before being promoted. The job was great, and everything ran smoothly, until a crisis hit another department, leaving it without a supervisor. Management decided they needed someone experienced to lead that department, so they transferred our supervisor there. In his place, they promoted someone from another department who had no leadership experience. Our department was running well, with no need for drastic changes, but our new supervisor didn't see it that way. One day, I arrived at work, and as usual at the beginning of the shift, the supervisor printed out a sheet listing the stores to be handled that day, along with which inspector was assigned to each one. So far, so good. He made some changes, but nothing too concerning. However, before we started working, he called the entire department for a quick meeting. In this meeting, he announced that he had reassigned which assistants would work with which inspectors, and showed us a printed list. To my surprise, there was no name next to mine. In other words, I was expected to work without an assistant. I protested immediately. I don't remember the exact details of the discussion, as it happened a long time ago, but basically, his idea was that as other assistants finished helping their assigned inspectors, whoever was available would come help me. Something that already happened naturally, as we had a strong case of camaraderie in our department. Plus, no one wanted to be seen by the bosses standing around and doing nothing. But it wasn't enough, it would overburden me. I tried to argue my case, but I couldn't convince him. Other inspectors were also left without assistance, but they were relatively new to the company and didn't say anything. Probably out of fear of losing their jobs or something similar. Well, since I couldn't change his mind, I accepted that I would be working without an assistant. I took the signs for the stores I was responsible for, found available docks for them, placed the signs at the dock gates, noted on the printed sheet which stores were at which docks, then went to the dock of the first store I would handle. I leaned against the wall, crossed my arms, and waited. Goods started arriving, but I didn't touch a single box. The dock filled up, and I didn't move an inch. After a few hours, the supervisor walked through the department to check on things, saw the state of my dock, and asked why the load wasn't being prepared. I simply said, "I don't have any assistants, how am I supposed to prepare the load?" and remained standing with my arms crossed. Eventually, some assistants came to help me, and when they did, I helped them with the heavy lifting. But soon, the inspectors they were originally assigned to needed more help, and of course, they left my load behind. By the end of the shift, one load was ready to be loaded onto the truck, but another was only halfway done. I placed the paperwork with the load details in a visible spot for whoever would finish it and left. As I was leaving, my supervisor asked about the loads. Without turning around, I told him where the papers were. He asked if I wasn't going to finish them, and I didn't even respond. The next day, he called me in for a meeting. When I arrived, the manager was also there. They asked me what had happened the previous day. I replied, nothing that I remember. They brought up the incomplete loads. I explained that my shift had ended and I couldn't stay for overtime, so I left the information for whoever would finish the job, and I even told the supervisor where the papers were. Then, I took out my wallet, pulled out my time card receipt, and showed them that I had clocked out at the designated time. They mentioned that I had spent most of the shift standing with my arms crossed. I responded that I had done my job, which, as stated in my contract, consisted solely of verifying the load, supervising assembly and loading, entering data into the system, sealing the truck, and printing the load summary. Nothing beyond that. I continued by saying that anything else I might do during my shift was purely out of goodwill to help the assistants and speed up the work. But on the previous day, I had chosen to exercise my right to not perform those extra tasks because I felt unfairly treated by my supervisor, who had not assigned me a dedicated assistant. That would have significantly overburdened me with tasks I wasn't paid to do. The manager simply looked at the supervisor and said, he needs to have an assistant. Then he turned to me and asked me to leave. The two of them stayed there for quite a while. That same day, I was assigned an assistant, and we never spoke of it again. Nothing like that ever happened again. The new supervisor's stint lasted only a few months before he returned to his previous role. He had put too much trust in employees he was friends with, but who weren't very competent at their jobs, and that was his downfall. Our old supervisor came back to his position, and everything improved again. I've got a question for all of you out there. Would you say after all these malicious compliance stories we've done here, that we've all developed a palate for these stories? This new supervisor was just a total load of nonsense. They got shipped back to their old job because they couldn't handle the logistics. OP, well done. You showed them that the workloads need to be evenly stacked or things will start toppling over. This story comes to us from Boppity Boopy. Need my ID after surgery? Bet. Hello, I have no idea how to start this off, so I'll just give the context and jump in. I, 24 female, have been seeing the dentist more often because I now have insurance. The last time I went to a dentist was when I was about 14 or 15. My dentist said a lot of my teeth are salvageable, but I did need to get a lot of teeth pulled, 7 to be exact. It took a couple months to get my teeth pulled and everything, and when it did, oh my lord. The front desk lady told me I'm going to be on antibiotics and pain medication. I'm still kinda recovering. My gums are still pretty sensitive, but overall fine. My brother, 27 male, was my ride. So I called him fresh out of surgery, and he's like, "You done with surgery?" I responded, "Yeah, but my mouth was stuffed with gauze." "I have no idea what you said, but I'm assuming you said yes." He came and got me, and the nurse and my brother had to help me into his truck. We went to the pharmacy, but they were on lunch break. After waiting 30 minutes, their lunch was over. My brother left me in the truck and went into the convenience store. He was in there for a while, like 15 minutes. To most, that doesn't seem long, but to me, since the anesthesia was beginning to wear off, I was squirming in discomfort. While my brother was in the store, the pharmacist was giving him a really hard time, telling him that they needed my ID and all that fun stuff. Cue the malicious compliance. My brother walked out, told me everything, and I began to cry. Just picture an adult woman with baby face, swollen, delirious, in pain, and fresh out of surgery, looking like she was trying to do the Chubby Bunny challenge. Anyway, my brother took me out of his truck and he had to guide me. So all the customers in the store saw a scrawny twig dragging a barely conscious noodle to the pharmacy. He sat me down in one of the chairs and I handed him my ID. The pharmacist was about to give him a hard time again, but he then pointed in my direction. All he saw was a lost adult drooling and bleeding clearly out of it, fresh out of surgery. And the look on his face was just glorious. He handed my brother my medication without much complaint, and we left. And before anyone gets onto my brother's case that he didn't need to drag me into the store, I want to make it clear, even then, I did not care about how silly I looked. I was too busy thinking about pink axolotls on stairs and how bad I needed a nap. Even looking back, I chuckle about it. OP added a couple of edits down at the bottom. The first one says, "So I want to clear up a couple of things. We're not mad at the pharmacist or anything, mildly annoyed at the most. We did not know that the painkillers would be narcotics. Since I always pick up my dad's medication, none of us saw any reason as to why they suddenly needed my ID for my meds. Then my brother dropped me back at the motel, story for another day. I just plopped onto the bed and my brother gave my dad my meds to make sure I took them. My dad saw that the meds were narcotics and he explained to us what they were. Was I listening to that conversation? Heck no, I was out like a light." Edit number 2 says, "Thank you all so much for your insights and sharing your experiences. As much as I would love to respond to everyone, I should not be on Reddit too much because I'm still trying to put myself first for my mental health. So after today, I won't be responding as much. Just know that if you have been through similar situations, my heart goes out to you. Thank you for the support." Jumping down to the comment section on this one, we have one from a user called Puzzled Velociraptor. It says, "In my state, ID isn't required. However, at my chain retail location, it is required from the person in front of me. Anyone the patient trusts can pick up the meds. We need to scan the pickup person's ID for safety reasons. People have claimed to have not gotten their meds before, and this ensures we know who picked them up just in case. It sucks that you went through that. Wish it was a similar policy where he could have just shown his ID so you didn't have to go in." OP responded and said, "Yeah, it's pretty annoying, but there wasn't really much else we could have done. I'm not too upset about it. I go to the pharmacy a lot to pick up my dad's and my own medications, so we didn't really give it too much thought. This comment was very insightful to help give me more understanding." Alright, so I think we all understand, and it's been drilled home a few times, about the pharmacist having to have ID to hand out a narcotic. That makes sense. But the pharmacist could have brushed up on their customer service skills in this case to let OP's brother know why it had to be done. In the end though, OP's brother did extract a solution and everything turned out okay. This story comes to us from MD Lapla, using tennis balls as malicious compliance. "I go to tennis classes at the local club twice a week. One of the other alumni on the class is a 50-year-old gardener. Cool guy, has been working in the business since he was like 20. We live in a smallish town, so a lot of people know him and he has worked for quite a few in town over the years. He's generally well liked and friends with mostly everybody. There's one thing he does wrong about his business. He trusts people a lot, to the point that sometimes he agrees on a price for some work without drafting a contract. He goes, does the job, and gets paid. The old handshakes and word are enough contract if you know the other guy school of thought. Right next to the tennis courts, there's a house with a big garden. One day, one of us overhit a ball and it ended up in said garden. Nothing out of the ordinary, it could happen. After the class, Gardner told us that the owner of said house owes him a lot of money because a couple of years ago he did a complete remodel and overhaul of the garden, and when he finished, the house owner asked him for a couple more days for payment. Those days turned into weeks, then turned into owner not returning Gardner phone calls. But since no contract was signed, Gardner couldn't go to the police about it, or at least he couldn't legally do anything about it. So he had an argument with the owner once when he ran into him. Owner straight up said he wasn't going to pay, and then he said, "What are you gonna do? Go ahead, try to make my garden a mess just like it was. You can't set foot on my property or I'll call the cops on you." Gardner ended up assuming the money was lost and moved on with it. A couple of classes after Gardner told us the story, Coach told us that they had to change the tennis balls since they were old and barely bouncy anymore. They do this like every couple months or so. There are around 3 to 4 carts with between 80 to 100 tennis balls per cart. Gardner asked Coach what he was going to do with the old ones since there's no recycling program for tennis balls in town or nearby. Coach said, "I'm probably going to toss them in the trash." Gardner asked Coach if he had no problem giving the balls to him after class. Coach said no, he was intrigued. After the class was finished, Gardner gathered the carts and began tossing all the balls to the house's garden. The rest of the class, Coach included, who also heard the story that Gardner told, understood and began helping. We threw around 300-something balls into Owner's garden. Owner showed up a couple of minutes later to complain, shouting, "Hey, you're doing it on purpose, making a mess of my garden," until he saw Gardner. He went mute, turned around, and left. Local police came a couple minutes later. Officer knows Gardner and chats with him for a couple of minutes. Then officer tells us there's a complaint about people tossing balls at the house. Coach smiles and says, "You know, they're learning, overhits happen." Officer smiles and says, "You're absolutely right, part of learning." Turns around and leaves. It has now become a tradition. Every time the club has to change the tennis balls, Coach makes sure Gardner gets all of the carts for a ceremonial game of tennis basketball, with Owner's garden being the bucket. Jumping down to the comments on this one, we have one from a user called Viernine. It says, "He didn't have a written contract, but he still had a contract and can prove he did the work. Owner had to let him onto his property. The gardener shouldn't have just let it go." Alright, so I understand this was a crime of opportunity where they had the balls and they were able to throw them into the garden. But if the gardener really wanted to cause an issue, you can actually buy balls online that are full of seeds of weeds and wildflowers, and the balls break when you throw them up in the air and they come down and hit the ground. Oh, I don't know, 10, 15 of those into that garden would probably take care of the complete garden for many years to come. Of course, as usual on this channel, this is not legal advice. If you enjoy daily Reddit stories, I encourage you to follow and give us a rating on your podcasting platform of choice. And if you're watching and listening on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button and drop a like on the video. It really helps us out. I thank you for watching and listening. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.